Hi, everybody, and welcome to another live chat with Polar Bears International. My name is Elise McCall. I'm the Director of Conservation Outreach and a staff scientist at Polar Bears International. And today I'm so excited to welcome some guests to talk about fat is fit for polar bears. We're going to talk all about polar bear diets, why blubber is the best for polar bears and not really maybe any other animal, definitely not humans. We have some experts joining us here today. We're so happy to welcome them. I'll start with um, Greg Tiemann. Greg, over to you. Can you please introduce yourself?
You bet. Thank you, Elisa. It's a pleasure to join you today. My name's Greg Tiemann. I'm an associate professor in the Faculty of Environmental and Urban Change at York University in Toronto. And I've been working on various aspects of polar bear ecology and conservation for, I hate to admit it, but more than 20 years. And most of that research is really focused on trying to figure out how polar bears eat, what they eat, and how they make a living on the ice.
Thanks, Greg. So, Greg is the expert in all things diet, but also is really supporting a lot of the coexistence work with polar bears. So, just to remind everybody, if you have questions, please send them throughout the whole broadcast. Pop them in YouTube and Facebook, anywhere you can get to us. Please do send us their questions. We have staff monitoring and sending them to me. So, anytime you think of something, send it our way. And I'm going to send this over to my colleague, Jeff York, up in Churchill. Hi, Jeff.
Hey, Elisa. My name's Jeff York. I'm the Senior Director of Science and Policy at Polar Bears International. So just oversee all the research stuff, the work we're doing, the work we're supporting, and then also a lot of our policy, government relations, partner relations kind of work. And like Greg, I hate to admit it, but I've been working on polar bears for 28 years now straight and been coming up to wonderful northern Manitoba for 17 years. And I'm really happy to be back here on the tundra.
That's so great. And it's nice to see you in the new buggy one, Jeff. That looks great. And we're keeping an eye out for polar bears today. There's a wonderful one on the cam right there. It really has been a neat season so far, if a little bit warm. Jeff, would you mind first, especially if we always have new viewers, setting the stage a little bit for why are polar bears there right now?
Sure. So this part of Hudson Bay and Western Hudson Bay specifically is unique in its geography and how it's kind of the land itself kind of juts out into the bay. Hudson Bay has a counterclockwise current predominantly, and so ice and currents move in that direction. Winds are also predominantly from the north, so most of the time. And then we have a third factor that along two areas of the Manitoba coast, we have large freshwater river systems pumping fresh water out into the bay and especially along that near shore. So all those things combine to bring ice to this region first. There's a lot of fresh water near shore. Northern winds are pushing cold water and any ice kind of towards the Manitoba coast, and it kind of sticks there. Reverse thing happens in the spring, late summer. When ice is melting, it's moving around the bay as well. This is sort of the last region between here and the Ontario coast where the last ice melts and bears jump off. So they get off near here, and this is where they come because the ice tends to form first and stay first along this coast.
And every fall, we are also there with explore.org and Frontiers North Adventures to watch the bears and help bring polar bears to people around the world. And we get asked every year when we think freeze up is going to happen because the bears disappear pretty soon after that ice appears on Hudson Bay. And it's always impossible for us to know for sure, but temperature does play a role. What's the weather like up there right now?
Too warm. It's almost Halloween here. There's not a stitch of snow in sight, and it's actively raining. Just yesterday, outside on the back deck of EV Tundra Buggy One, we had mosquitoes, we had flies, and we had moths. Something I have not seen in 17 years coming up here this late in the year.
I've never seen that. That's pretty wild. Okay, so we probably still have at least a couple weeks of watching the polar bears. We'll be there every day, talking to people about them. And a big reason why we highlight polar bears this time of year and a theme that we come back to again and again because it's very obvious is their diet at this time of the year. So I think many viewers as well from the explore.org community, they've spent their whole kind of late summer, early fall watching the brown bear cams at Katmai. And those brown bears just gorging themselves on fish, getting so fat, and it's so fun. And then we shift over to polar bear cams and it's quite a different scenario. So today we really wanted to do a deeper dive into polar bear diets, polar bear bodies, what's going on with these bears. Jeff, are they eating much when you're watching them right now?
Not at all. Most of the bears we're seeing here, especially in the wildlife management area, they're just resting. They're just hanging out. We will see occasionally bears go over to these kelp beds and paw around and have a few bites of what would be like a polar bear salad on the beach, but that's about it.
Right. So really polar bears are looking for a different type of food. So we're gonna throw it over to Dr. Greg Tiemann. And Greg, really you're such an expert in all things kind of polar bear diet. I'll kind of let you start off where you want to start at. What are polar bears really wanting to eat in their diet?
Well, ideally, throughout the year, they would like to eat seals. That's the primary component of their of thousands of years to focus on are marine mammals and first and foremost ring seals, which are a relatively small-bodied marine mammal found throughout the circumpolar Arctic. They're abundant, they're ubiquitous, they're in all kinds of different habitats, they're in every part of the polar bear range, and there really is a very strong sort of ecological, biological between those two species. Um, when it comes to polar bear diets, polar bear feeding habits, we're talking about extraordinarily high seasonality, which means there's a brief period every year where polar bears do the vast bulk of their feeding. It's not right now. It's not during the onshore period. It happens in late spring, early summer in a coincident with ring seal breeding and pupping. So when those new pups are born and they're nursed by their mother and then they're weaned from their mother, they end up as quite large, quite high fat content seal pups. And those seal pups, more than really anything else, fuel polar bear energy through much of the rest of the year. So when the sea ice melts in the summer, in parts of their range where the sea ice melts in the summer and bears are forced to migrate onshore, they're just kind of waiting. They're just kind of waiting for the next opportunity to get back on the sea ice and start feeding. And through the fall and winter, mostly just trying to maintain their body mass until they can get back to that ring seal pupping season. That really is the grocery store in terms of their food supply for most of the year.
Right. So there really is the main time of year where they're eating a lot. How much weight will they gain in what period of time to be able to sustain themselves through the rest of the year?
Yeah, that's a great question. They'll put on, it depends on the bear. It depends on the prey. Um, and it depends on where they're sort of starting from. So, among the most important members of the polar bear population are going to be reproducing females, breeding females. And so, if they've produced a litter, if they've had cubs over the winter, they're coming out of the den just before that ring seal pupping season. They've been nursing their pups for the most exhausted their stored fat. And so they're going to put on, hopefully, a truly massive amount of weight. And similarly, if they're preparing for pregnancy, they're accumulating those fat stores to produce cubs and feed them through the coming winter, yeah, they could almost double their body mass. So it depends on what the bear is, what sort of state they're in. If it's a big male, they actually tend to not put on a great deal of weight because they're already big and just carrying more mass is sometimes more expensive. So it really does depend on the bear, but we could certainly be talking about 100 pounds or more.
That's impressive. So we kind of mentioned males and females. Are they hunting the same species? Are they hunting in the same way? Males are so much bigger than female polar bears. Do they have more options available to them?
For sure, they certainly do. So females are, and again, it's a natural world, so there's going to be all kinds of variation. And it probably is wise to preface everything with the recognition that polar bears are bears, and bears want to eat. And they, in that context, will eat whatever's around. And we can talk about some of the diversity in there, but typically when they're foraging on the sea ice, given their body size, given their sometimes more limited habitat requirements, if a female has young cubs that she's trying to protect, she's going to be a little bit more savvy in where she goes and what she does. And so females will very often be more limited to ring seals, the smallest kind of marine mammal prey that's going to be found in most places. Whereas males, sometimes unencumbered adult females are a bit more free to go farther offshore where they can interact with and potentially prey on larger bearded seals, which may be three or four or even five times larger than ring seals. So bearded seals are also found at lower density, but also found widely throughout the circumpolar Arctic. They represent a really massive component if a polar bear does manage to catch one of their diet intake. So yeah, they're also able to scavenge on whales that may die and wash up. In various parts of the range, there are other seals that may be available. But yeah, polar bear males being about twice the size of adult females certainly have more options when it comes to foraging.
And I'll throw this one over to Jeff. I know, so we were in Svalbard this summer together for a bit, and we saw a couple dead walruses on the beach, and we got a lot of questions about polar bears eating walrus. Why wasn't a polar bear actively on this dead walrus right now? Could you talk to us a bit about the walrus situation in the Arctic?
Sure. So walrus are sort of like the next biggest prey item that's out there for some polar bears. They're not as widespread as either ring seals or bearded seals, but where they do occur, they often overlap with polar bears. They can be two, almost three times the weight of polar bears at their largest size. There, adult walrus have very little concern about predation from polar bears. They have, I mean, one, their size is quite large, but their skin is so incredibly tough. And it's tough just due to the life that they live. If you ever get to see male walrus hauled out together, they're constantly like stabbing each other pretty, to us, it would look violent with those large tusks, with no, harm apparently done there. So as adults, I've seen polar bears come out to haul outs next to males. I mean, I'm talking feet away, and the walrus weren't the least bit concerned that this large male polar bear was out there with them. Young walrus, another story. They tend to stay at the water's edge or in the water with their mums, and their mums can be quite protective. So in general, like polar bears are looking for carcasses like we saw in Svalbard, but the toughness of that skin, right? It's not something that even after they've died of natural causes, that's immediately available to most polar bears because it's a difficult package to open, so to speak. So what colleagues in Russia have seen who've been around and have been able to observe this is it goes days to weeks before there's enough decomposition and softening of that skin before polar bears can start to really get in there and get at all those calories.
Interesting. Yeah, that's a good amount of time. So we've talked a little bit about preferences and what the polar bears are eating. Greg, how do you know? How do you know what the bears are eating there? We did an event earlier this week that was all about how polar bears live so far away from people. How can we even get at what they're eating? What sort of analyses are you doing to figure that out?
Well, it's not a straightforward process, certainly, and it's been an ongoing challenge really since people have been doing scientific research on polar bears. The preliminary work was really based on, some observational data, although those are hard to systematically collect from polar bears because we're talking about, a widely distributed animal in a pretty challenging place when they're foraging on the sea ice. It's hard to get a good look at them. So a lot of the early studies on polar bear foraging came from prey remains, like being out on the sea ice, whether you're working on polar bears or not, and you come across some carcasses of seals, and you can quantify how many of those carcasses there are, how much of those carcasses have been consumed, and that sort of thing. Other sort of typical um, wildlife biology approaches, like looking at scat analysis. So a common way of measuring an animal's diet is seeing what comes out of them. So analyzing their poop and seeing what sorts of remains are in there. For polar bears, that's very challenging because they're eating mostly soft tissue. They're eating mostly blubber and muscle, and those tissues are really well digested. So there's not a lot of hard parts that are coming out. Like if you were studying the diet of a seal, there'll be lots of little bones and scales that you can identify to access. So for polar bears, given all these challenges, what's really emerged as a useful approach is using biochemical analyses. So taking a sample of polar bear tissue, analyzing its composition, and then trying to attribute in a mathematical way, in a quantitative way, how much of those components came from different dietary sources. So, for instance, much of my work uses fatty acid analysis. So these are big molecules that comprise basically all of polar bear and all of our dietary fats. And they are incorporated from the diet into the bear's tissue pretty predictably, almost in some cases exactly directly, so that we can sort of reconstruct what the bear's been eating based on the composition of its storage tissue, in this case, fat. So I guess in that sense, the old adage is true, in that you are what you eat, and that's very helpful in trying to understand polar bears and polar bear ecology.
That's pretty funny. Yeah, could you talk just a little bit more about that? Because I know polar bears are super efficient at that conversion that you talked about, eating what they eat going directly onto their body. Like it's a pretty high percentage of what they're eating that they can convert.
Yeah, and it makes sense when we're talking about, like, I feel like everybody appreciates fat, well, dietary fat. When we're talking about dietary fat, there's a lot of energy in fat. And that energy comes from the fact that fat is made up of fatty acids, which are long hydrocarbon chains. They're big molecules with lots of chemical bonds in them, primarily between a carbon atom and a hydrogen atom. Each of those bonds has energy. And you derive energy from metabolizing, digesting, utilizing those fatty acids by breaking them down. And that releases chemical energy that you can use for growth or movement or activity or whatever you want. But if you're a bear, or really any animal, but we'll talk about polar bears, if you're a polar bear eating a lot of fat, you're ingesting a lot of these big molecules, and you want to save them, right? You want to store them up because this is your big chance to accumulate energy that lasts through the rest of the year. You don't want to spend a bunch of energy breaking down this big molecule and messing around with it and storing it in little bits and pieces. So you're pretty much going to take that big molecule, attach it to a protein in your blood to move it to your fat stores and plunk it there. You're going to park it in the metabolic garage, if we can mix some metaphors. So, like, we're not going to break it down and reassemble it. Bears will just take that ingested big fatty acid and deposit it in their fat stores. So that ends up, not to say that some of them aren't metabolized, or some of them are in fact synthesized or changed in a variety of ways. But we understand those ways, we can predict those ways, and for the most part, that bear is trying to save energy by depositing ingested fats as directly as they can in their tissue.
Pretty wild. So we have a question from Burr the Bear, and they say, is he saying that the fat from the bear is the same as the animal they've eaten? And then, Greg, maybe you could also talk about the difference or no difference between blubber and fat.
Okay, yeah. So yeah, in a sense, I am saying that the fat from the seals is the same fat that's in the bear, like in a very real sense. And again, some of these molecules are going to be modified through digestion and metabolism, but some of them are like literally the same molecule goes from the seal and is deposited in the bear's fat. Um, when it comes to the difference between fat and blubber, I think there is an important distinction because we have in various contexts sometimes consideration of polar bears as a marine mammal, which they are in a very real ecological sense, right? That they make their living off of the marine environment. Sometimes for conservation or legislative reasons, in some places, polar bears may also be technically considered a marine mammal. But biologically, evolutionarily, they're not. They're a bear. And so they have bear habits, they have bear anatomy, and they have fat that's just like any other bear, any other mammal. It's adipose tissue. So it's the same kind of fat that we have under our skin, they have under theirs. Marine mammals are different. Marine mammals occupy a completely different habitat, right? They're living underwater. And among the challenges of living in the water is energy, is heat conservation, is not losing your body heat to the outside world. Humans and every other terrestrial mammal have that same challenge, and we very often use hair as an insulator, but seals and whales don't have that option. So they've evolved a specialized kind of adipose tissue that helps them stay insulated. It also does other things. It gives shape to their body. It stores energy. It does a bunch of other things besides just storing dietary fat. So that specialized adipose tissue that we see in marine mammals is called blubber, and that's it. Like those are the only animals that have blubber. Polar bears don't have blubber. People don't have blubber. Foxes don't. Anyway, you get the idea. Only seals and whales have blubber, and it's a specialized kind of adipose tissue because it's got more protein in it. It's got more collagen, so because it has to maintain its shape more than our fat does. It tends to have more vascularization, more blood vessels. It's doing a lot of different things that polar bear fat or our fat is not doing.
Greg, do you think if we presented a polar bear with fat versus blubber, it would be able to tell a difference or prefer the blubber, or it might taste the same or smell the same? I mean, I don't know. It's maybe a weird question.
Yeah, and it's a fair question. I honestly don't have an answer for you. Again, bears are bears, and very often in many contexts, they're not especially picky. So when it comes to those sorts of subtle differences, um, if you gave them blubber versus protein, some kind of ground meat, we can come up with a better estimate of what they prefer. But blubber versus fat, yeah, I suspect they'd be very keen on both. So I'd hesitate to say whether they'd like one more than the other.
So this is, I think, a good opportunity to then kind of focus in on like why polar bears can't live long term on land then. And so, Jeff, I wanted to throw it over to you. I first wanted, so I know Albert, who's running everything behind the scenes, thanks, Albert, got this great clip from the cams the other day and put it together. So, when we talk about polar bears and polar bear conservation and accessing seals, it's all about the sea ice and the presence of Arctic sea ice and polar bears using this ice to access that food for the most part. That's how they're hunting. But when seals are swimming in open water, it's much harder for polar bears to get to them. So I don't know if Elbert, you're able to find that video. He was able to capture a little bit from the cams where, there we go. I think there's going to be some circles that pop up. So there's a seal swimming in the water, and then also a polar bear swimming in the water. And you could see that the polar bear just wouldn't be able to access this seal very easily. Seals can outswim polar bears in the water. So really having the presence of sea ice or something that gives that bear the advantage is quite helpful. Maybe that's a little bit hard to see there. There we go. Right. So swimming polar bear. Albert just put this together. There we go. The seals watching the polar bear. I just think that's like a good illustration. We've seen that a couple times on the tundra, outside of Buggy One, where we've seen it, what was a year or two ago, there was a polar bear right on the beach watching a seal swimming, and the seal seemed to be taunting this bear, and the bear rushed into the water, and the seal was gone in 2 seconds. So the sea ice is very important. When the bears are on land, as Greg has said a couple times now, they are bears. They're looking for food. Jeff, I was wondering if you could speak to us a little bit about terrestrial feeding, particularly, we get asked a lot lately about these reindeer in Svalbard. What's going on with that?
Sure. And I think, like, bringing it back to what Greg said, at the end of the day, while polar bears are highly specialized, they're still bears and they will try to eat what's around. And so we know that bears on occasion do get a drop on a seal in an open water situation, just not very often. Like, it's super rare for them to do that. We know polar bears on land will take advantage of food sources they can find, especially if they're young growing bears or if they're older bears in poor body condition. They're gonna nose around. They're gonna eat berries. Here in this region, they're gonna predate shorebird, goose nesting areas, things like that that are fairly easy to find and get. They're gonna look for carrion for, dead terrestrial animals or dead marine mammals that might wash up. And then, like you mentioned, Svalbard's a pretty unique case where we have a recovering and expanding reindeer population as that part of the Arctic warms faster than anywhere else. It's also creating more habitat for reindeer on land. And so you have this growing Svalbard reindeer population. They're about ring seal size. They're quite small in the caribou world there, and we do appear to be seeing more polar bears take advantage of them. It's an active research question. We don't know if that's just something that hadn't been seen as much and we're looking more now, so we're seeing it, or if it truly is increasing. But in most of polar bears' range, they don't have tiny reindeer to take advantage of at large numbers. So that's a pretty unique source of potential calories for those bears. And then, like Greg said, when you look at what polar bears are evolved to do and that highly efficient use of marine dry fats, even in the fall, Svalbard reindeer do put on a nice fat layer, but it's not blubber. It's a terrestrial dry fat. It'll have a completely different fatty acid composition, and we don't know what the long-term effect of polar bears eating that kind of fat would do to them versus the marine derived fats that they've evolved with. So, open research question.
Yeah, so interesting. So you gave kind of this local example of a Svalbard and reindeer and polar bears eating that. We know there's a few pockets of the world. So polar bears, of course, they span the circumpolar north. We have 20 different subpopulations that kind of have different scenarios in terms of their sea ice patterns and different pressures. One example we get asked about from the Hudson Bay area is a little bit north of Churchill, where people have seen polar bears hunting beluga together. And it's not something we see all over the place. It's a unique scenario. Could you explain a little bit about what might be going on in that one area?
Sure, I think this is an interesting way to look at the difference between what I would call ecological or genetic adaptation. I think of that as kind of true adaptation versus behavioral adaptation. So polar bears are very behaviorally plastic. They're very smart animals. They're very long-lived. And the case up north is more polar bears using a style of hunting that they normally do on ice, but doing it from rocks that are out in this shallow water. So as the tide comes up, they have a couple meters of depth in that part of the bay, and you have smaller, younger whales who's flown by that are more susceptible to that kind of surprise still hunting. So same type of hunting they would do on floating ice, just using a rock platform to access these naive and younger bowhead whales. Now we've seen something similar happen at our in our newest subpopulation, right? The 20th in Southeast Greenland. And there, bears and seals both have shifted from using sea ice as a platform around the year to in the summer using freshwater glacial ice, using the glacial front and the calving icebergs there as platforms to do all the things they normally do on sea ice, but just using freshwater ice. So again, a behavioral adaptation to short-term change. Not sure how applicable some of those are to the broader Arctic and to polar bears across their range who don't have some of those opportunities and some of those realities.
Right. We've got a question from Willy Nilly 7. Do whales ever wash up on the shore at Hudson Bay that the bears might eat? Are dead whales an option sometimes?
Here they have, again, it's uncommon, but we have had last year, I think some were on the Explore Cam. We had a adult beluga whale carcass that washed up in the mouth of the river, and it was absolutely utilized by polar bears. There in other parts of the Arctic, Wrangel Island, there's some famous pictures over 100 polar bears in the on the background of a large whale carcass that stranded on Wrangel Island several years ago. So those whale carcasses can be an important or play an important role in polar bear diet, especially in some parts of the Arctic.
Right. We've got another question kind of in the vein of playing an important role. So Sean from Omi Nerves Photography, and you might know more about this, Jeff, since you've been in Churchill for a bit already. Maybe there was a recent mom and couple cubs that got a bearded seal potentially on the shore, which does happen occasionally. They can get lucky. How would a successful hunt or eating a seal right now, how would that help a mom and cubs last until freeze up, whenever that might be? Will it have a big impact?
Absolutely. They're polar bears here, and Greg mentioned it in the intro. They're at a stage now where they've been here on shore all summer. They've mostly not eaten, and they've definitely most of them haven't had that kind of high fat marine mammal prey that they would like to have. So if they can get lucky and get that resource for that individual bear, or we often even see bears sharing even smaller prey like seals there, that's a huge win for those bears, getting them through this next period of time before the ice starts to come in.
Now, we get a lot of questions from our Explore.org viewers asking us to compare brown bears and polar bears, which is always really interesting. All of this kind of brings up for me a couple questions comparing. First of all, would brown bears share as nicely as polar bears share sometimes? I guess it depends on the scenario. Um, but brown bears seem a little more aggressive sometimes on food than polar bears, or is that, am I wrong? I might be wrong.
I would tend to agree with you. We'll see what Greg says. When you look at brown bears where they occur in a place like coastal BC or Alaska, along the coast where they have regular predictable access to things like salmon runs, you see tremendous tolerance for bears with one another, and you see tremendous tolerance for bears towards people because there's so many calories, right? There's just no reason to behave otherwise. When you look at brown bears as you go further north and get up to what we call tundra grizzly, the smallest of the brown bears who live the furthest north where calories are scarce, all indications are that they're behaviorally the most aggressive. They have the largest home ranges and they defend those home ranges much more so. So, yeah, it depends on the brown bear and the context and where, but Greg probably has more thought on that.
No, not really much to add. I think that there are certainly intrinsic sort of differences in the biology and temperament of the species, but I think when it comes down to you know, the immediate circumstance of whether or not a bear is going to get aggressive over or defensive over its food, it really does depend on how much food is around. And if there's lots, then why not share? And if there's not, then that's a different context, I think, whether you're a black bear or a brown bear or a white bear. Yeah, it really depends on how much is around. And in fact, just to add to Jeff's comment, I think that there are photographs or reports and instances um, from the North Slope of Alaska, where you do have potentially large bowhead whale carcasses available for bears on shore. There have been instances of certainly many polar bears sharing together, as well as the occasional brown bear ends up in the mix. And yeah, there's enough to go around. So it's not really worth anybody's trouble to get into a fight over something that is too abundant to really defend anyway.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's we've seen that at least in that context where polar bears feeding on a bowhead whale carcass in northern Alaska. Here comes a tundra grizzly running in at full speed, kind of using a sloth bear style approach of I'm just going to tear everybody's face off. And the polar bear is just saying, hey, knock yourself out. We're just going to walk over here, let you have your moment with the whale because again, there's so much. They're in good body condition. There's plenty of food. They're not going to tangle with this little brown bear. Um, and I think that is a key difference between the two species broadly is for a polar bear, they tend to be more risk averse. They tend to be more risk averse because injuries to them can be a much more detrimental. They're obligate carnivores, meaning they pretty much have to go out and find and kill their prey. If they have an injury to their paws or claws or their jaws, they're probably not going to make it. Brown bears, black bears in North America and Europe, if they have injuries, they can eat a lot of different foods. They don't have to catch and kill something to survive until that injury heals. So that is a key difference between the two.
That's interesting. And that answered a question, another one from Bur the Bear, about do brown bears and polar bears ever cross over? And would polar bears get prime picks because they're bigger? So not necessarily, kind of depends on the scenario there. So Joan Mullally, 4934 is asking, are there black bears around the Churchill area? Would they interact with polar bears?
Go for it, Greg.
I don't know. I would imagine I haven't spent nearly as much time in Churchill as you guys have. Certainly, so much of my recent work is focused in my home province of Ontario, and we have lots of black bears here, and they certainly overlap in range with polar bears. There haven't been really much in the way of reports of overlap. Outside of a few, landfill encounters. So, dumps, waste dump sites. You can potentially have both polar bears and black bears, but they seem to, yeah, not interact a whole lot. Obviously, black bears are much smaller than a polar bear, and so yeah, there's not a whole lot of interaction there. But I'd be curious to hear what Jeff has to say about the situation in Churchill.
Yeah, so here we do actually get all three species of bear. Black bear, of course, are forest bears. They tend to stay in the boreal. I'm sure they pop out from time to time to check out what's happening. They're also curious, smart, long-lived animals. Here, we just don't see reports of that. We don't have historical evidence of that. And given the number of both researchers and tourism folks that have been in this area for a long time, you would think, and indigenous peoples for a much longer time, you'd think that somebody would have documented that kind of interaction at some point. We did recently have a photographer, and it was in Newfoundland, Labrador, I'm pretty sure, documented black bear and polar bear interacting in a coastal area around a kill. And if I recall correctly, the polar bears chased the black bear off, and that was the end of that.
That makes a lot of sense.
Hmm.
Wanted to circle back to the brown bear for a minute and get a little bit more at the evolutionary and physiological differences between the brown and polar bear, because we know polar bears evolved from brown bears to take advantage of the sea ice habitat to hunt seals, to specialize in eating blubber. What would be some of the physical differences between the brown and polar bear that allow the polar bear to better eat and metabolize fat or blubber. And then I know, Jeff, you have a skull with you. I don't know, are the teeth different, or is the digestive system different, or what really happened to split these species apart? And Greg, or either of you that want to take that one.
Well, Jeff's got
I'm just
the skull, so let's start there.
Perfect.
yeah, I'm just holding this up as a skull model. So go for it.
Yeah, well, so if we had also a brown bear skull that someone else was holding, then we could see some pretty distinct differences. So the skull morphology on the polar bear is very much a carnivore sort of shape and overall anatomy, where the pivot point is more in line with the gape, that we've got a fairly sloped forehead. We've got obviously very prominent canines, long, sharp canines, and then the cheek teeth, the molars on the both upper and lower jaw, relative to a brown bear, are going to be much smaller and sharper, so more appropriate for slicing, tearing, rather than the more elongate and flat surface of a brown bear's molars that are more appropriate, obviously, for grinding plant material. Excuse me. And so the brown bear's skull would be more, there would be a greater sort of dish to the top of the skull. And then if we looked at the claws, we would see differences there. Brown bears have very long and more slender claws, appropriate for digging in the dirt, tearing open logs. That sort of thing. And then in comparison, the polar bear is going to have shorter, stouter claws, more robust for subduing prey and for navigating the sea ice. In terms of their biology, though, there are certainly genetic adaptations associated with, life in the cold, metabolizing a very high-fat diet without suffering the consequences of cardiovascular disease and that sort of stuff. But we probably shouldn't overemphasize the differences between the two species because, biologically, despite these pretty dramatic visible differences that have evolved over a pretty short time, it's been a pretty short time evolutionarily. We're probably looking at the time scale of about 500,000 years, which is a long time, granted, but not in an evolutionary sense. So they still very much retain many of the physiological and nutritional characteristics of the original brown bear lineage. So to the point where they can even interbreed, right? One of the classic definitions that we use for what is a species is, well, they're reproductively isolated. In this case, they're not. Brown bears and polar bears can and have interbred. So that I think speaks to their still remaining biological similarity.
Yeah, fascinating. We'll have to be careful, Jeff. We might lose you to be a skull model one of these days. You're doing such a good job. We've got a couple questions I'd love to throw. I guess I'll throw this one to Jeff. So, previously, we've talked about polar bears eating reindeer, eating beluga, and how they're so smart and they can figure, different things out to get food because they're a bear and they're always hungry. Hannah 139 says, well, it sounds like they're starting adapt to climate change potentially. Is that the case with how they have some behavioral plasticity? Is that the same as adapting to climate change?
Yeah, I think again that's a great opportunity to talk about the difference between the two. Polar bears are and will do everything in their kind of behavioral quiver to make changes, to make adjustments. They always have, and we see a pretty broad range of strategies with polar bears right now, where places like Hudson Bay, bears come ashore every summer, have for a very long time, and are used to periods of fasting. There were in other parts of the Arctic that they don't do that. They stay with the ice. They have access to food year round and don't need to do that kind of shift in their behavior or their approach to that. So that being said, what we're looking at now is fairly rapid environmental change, rapid loss of sea ice, rapid changes, leading to rapid changes in distribution, changes to when and where bears can den and have their young. So, bears are again behaviorally shifting, trying to find another place that works in the case of denning as well. But we're asking more of them than exists in their behavioral quiver. And the change is also happening at a rate that's going to challenge true adaptation to take place. When you look genetically at polar bears compared to their brown bear relatives, they have far less plasticity, so far less adaptive capacity than their brown bear cousins uh, as they approach this time of rapid change.
Right. That's important to keep in mind, absolutely, as we're watching how things are changing, particularly for this population of polar bears. Jeff, we've seen the Western Hudson Bay polar bears change in the last couple decades. What's going on with these bears for those that might not know?
So here we have seen a quantifiable reduction in the abundance of this population. We've seen, changes in body condition, changes in the size of adult bears, and lower survival in some years, with a trend in lower survival overall over the last several decades leading there to be fewer bears in this subpopulation today than there were 30, 40 years ago there. So bears here are spending longer periods ashore in most years. This year, we've already exceeded 130 days off the ice. And we'll see. Like as I said earlier at the beginning, you look behind me and around me, and it's pretty brown here. It's not freezing. There's no snow. There's not even a chance of ice anytime soon out in the bay.
Right, they do have their limits, absolutely. Okay, Greg, we've got a question. I'm going to throw this one to you first. So this is from Joanna Giovanna Benz. And this is good because it highlights that we can be a bit more clear too about another aspect of how polar bears and brown bears are different. What ways are the scientists using to monitor in the tundra the amount of food the polar bear finds in the area to survive winter hibernation?
Yeah, can you say that one more time? Say that one more time, please.
I'll kind of summarize it. So, how are scientists studying polar bears in the tundra to better understand the food they're finding and eating, and how is that supporting them through a winter hibernation?
Okay. So a couple of different ways to approach that. We've already talked about some of the ways that we use to sort of disentangle polar bear diets, kind of what it is that they're eating. How much they're eating, though, is almost a trickier topic. It is difficult to know exactly how much they're eating because the techniques that we use typically tell us what proportion of their diet is made up of different components or different prey types. So if those relative proportions change, we can detect that. But if the total amount of food declines that they're eating, that's tougher to see. And our best understanding of that really comes from, well, how big are they, or how fat they are? Because for polar bears, given everything that we've sort of have talked about, the high seasonality of their environment, of their food supply, being fat is fit, as you've pointed out. So the more fat a bear has on its body, the more we can conclude that it's been eating and in the better shape that it's in. And every bear typically wants to be as big, as fat as it can. So, there's a few different ways that we can use to try to estimate body condition, like the overall fatness or health of polar bears. You can catch some bears and weigh them. That's certainly the most accurate way to assess it. There's some insights that we've gotten, and PBI has been among the leaders in this in trying to photograph or visually assess polar bear body condition, so non-invasively from a distance. And there have been, different approaches to that have been deployed. We can also, some of my research has used samples from harvested bears. So polar bears in Canada are harvested sustainably by indigenous people, primarily Inuit across Canada. They submit samples of bears that they take that we can use to analyze their diet, as well as get some insights into their overall body condition. So how much they've been eating, at least in a relative sense. So that's provided some really important information on polar bear feeding habits over time and across seasons. Um, I think that did that more or less cover it.
Yeah.
And then compared to, yeah, compared to
And
what's
the
that?
hibernation thing too. So the
Oh,
brown
right.
bears
Yes, yes, yes.
are hibernating over the winter. We used to think maybe polar bears had a sort of summer walking hibernation that they must reduce their energy consumption or something, but we know that that's not quite the same. So what's the difference with hibernation between these bears?
I knew there was another component to the question, and anyway, I talked myself into a corner. But yeah, so our understanding of how polar bears deal with seasonal periods where food is really not available is still evolving, and it's not we certainly don't have all the answers, but we've got more answers than we sort of used to. Because their feeding is so seasonal, and they, in many parts of the range, like in Churchill, have a period where they're on shore. There's no seals for the most part. There's really very little for them to eat. And how do they get by? And polar bears can do some pretty impressive things to deal with those seasonal food shortages. As you said, we used to kind of consider it a form of walking hibernation. So anyway, as an academic, I like to get into the details. So, what bears across their diversity do is not true hibernation like we see in small mammals and rodents, which is characterized by periods of torpor where the animal drops their body temperature to essentially ambient and achieves really amazing energy savings by being in that state of torpor. No bears do that. They're too big really to do that. So hibernating black bears and brown bears have other adaptive fasts, as they're known, where they drop their body temperature a little bit. They recycle waste products, specifically urea. They conserve protein that spares them from, muscle loss or atrophy. And we used to think that polar bears could just kind of switch into that sort of state while remaining active on the sea ice. And that doesn't entirely seem to be the case, but they will do a couple of things that are like other bears. They will drop their body temperature a couple of degrees. We've seen that in some wild work. We've done some work with the Toronto Zoo that's shown a similar body drop in body temperature of about 2 or 3 degrees when the bears are even eating less. Polar bears can do some recycling of nitrogenous waste. So the waste that comes from metabolizing protein, we do know that bears are recycling that to some extent. Polar bears are recycling that to some extent, maybe not as much as or as efficiently as brown bears and black bears are doing. So the jury is still kind of out. The take-home message is that polar bears don't hibernate in the same sense that other bears do, but they certainly are well adapted to these seasonal fasts. But when it comes to, as you said, the biological limits of these fasts, they definitely exist, and there's going to be points where a polar bear, despite its adaptation to a seasonal environment, is just going to be pushed beyond its limits.
Oh, that's a great explanation. Thanks, Greg. We have time. We're going to take one more quick question, and it's going to go, of course, every time we mention brown polar bear hybrid, people are going to ask questions because it's just so interesting. So just really quickly, are they called Growler bears or Pisleys? And then what would they do in terms of hibernation, do you think? How could we know?
Yeah, I'm gonna remain agnostic about what you call them. I will point out that despite a kind of cluster of them that we saw in the 2010s in the Western Arctic, they do not seem to be a widespread phenomenon, and they are not quite numerous enough to come up with any really insights onto how they about their natural history. But I think based on their behavior, you learn from your if you're a bear, you learn from your mom, and so it depends on who your mom is, and so in literally every case of documented hybrid animals, the mom has been a polar bear. So I would expect the life history strategy to be most similar to that.
And just a quick add-on, Elisa, with that one too, is the idea. Some people ask, like, might there be an advantage to being a hybrid, like some superpower or something? And the reality is no. If there was, we'd see them. They would exist out across, polar bear range, like Greg mentioned. They don't. It was a pretty unique situation in one really small geography, and it's run its course. And as far as we know, none of those bears exist today, and we haven't seen it pop up elsewhere.
Right. We have two pretty great bear species already. The brown bears living life on land, and then we have our blubber hunting ice bears, the polar bears. Thank you so much, Greg, for joining us today and telling
Okay.
us more about their diets and kind of doing a deeper dive into that side of things. It's just so fascinating. And Jeff, thank you for joining us from Churchill. I'm excited to see you in a couple days. What's next for you for the rest of the day? I assume you guys are trundling out here and folks can watch the Evie Buggy One Cam.
Absolutely. We're going to roll further out on the tundra. We're going to go find some bears to view, and we're going to connect with some of our partners from EV Tundra Buggy One.
Amazing. And a huge thanks to, of course, Frontiers North Adventures for hosting us up there and helping make this happen, and explore.org, helping us bring polar bears to people all around the world. So stay tuned for next week, though. Well, of course, we'll have cams running all day, every day, all through the weekend. But next week is extra special to us. It is Polar Bear Week, and we're kicking it off on Sunday. We've got all sorts of awesome things that you can take part in if you'd like. We have, first of all, we just have kind of a call out for your art. Next week, we're extra celebrating kind of the marriage of science and art and how important that is to conservation. So if you have polar bear art, please send it to us. We're going to put more information about that in the chat, and you'll hear about it all next week. Also, keep an eye out. There's a new activity to do with explore.org, and that will be kicking off pretty soon as well. That will be very fun. It's kind of a journey. You can get snapshots on the cam and win prizes. We also have multiple events next week, so look at the calendar. We've got webcasts, we've got a live chat, and we're hosting a special guest, Aaron Blaze, who is an animator with Disney and who has created his own short animated film about a polar bear. Snow Bear. So we'll be talking more about that as well. It's going to be a really fun week. I'll finally be there in Churchill, so I'm very excited. And thank you again to this audience. You are really the ones that are helping drive what we do, helping us spread the love of polar bears. We so appreciate your questions today and you being just such a wonderful community on the cams and helping us love these polar bears like we all do. So have a great rest of your day. Happy Halloween, everybody. And we will see you next week. And thanks again to our guests and to Albert behind the scenes. Bye, everybody.
Future generations of people and polar bears depend on the decisions and plans that we make today. A polar bear's life cycle is almost exclusively tied to the sea ice. Because polar bears rely on sea ice to hunt, to breed, and sometimes to den, sea ice loss from climate change is their biggest threat, and the reason the bears are listed as vulnerable on the IUCN's Red List of Threatened Species. What we learn about climate change impacts on polar bears in Hudson Bay can be applied across the Arctic to help conserve other populations. Climate change is already affecting some populations of polar bears. Since we get most of our energy from fossil fuels, we are producing huge amounts of carbon dioxide. You see, regular amounts of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere act like a blanket around the Earth, trapping heat and keeping our planet at a stable temperature. However, when we burn fossil fuels like coal, oil, and natural gas for energy, we pump rampant amounts of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. This buildup thickens the blanket, trapping too much heat, disrupting the climate, and melting Arctic sea ice. When Arctic waters are cold enough, the top layer freezes into a special type of ice called sea ice. Sea ice is to the ocean what soil is to a forest. It supports the entire Arctic food chain. Food from this marine ecosystem also sustains northern communities. The key to getting the climate back to functioning the way it should, and to preserving a future for polar bears across the Arctic, is to move away from using fossil fuels for energy altogether. The most important thing we can do is vote with the climate in mind to let our leaders know we support a swift transition to renewable energy sources. In the meantime, we can directly participate in and learn more about our local and regional renewable energy options. We can all make a difference outside our own households by influencing where our energy comes from. Because together, we can make sure that polar bears roam the Arctic sea ice for generations to come.